Right. Okay.
Right.
Yes. Please.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Am I
Morning.
audible? Okay.
Yeah, you're audible.
So good morning, everybody. I welcome you to this series of webinars that we've been organizing. Our team has been organizing under this innovative pedagogical learning. And just to tell you in brief about our team, we have got together. We know each other since past 10 years, and we kind of share common interests of forensic odontology, scientific writing. But in these COVID times when we were under lockdown, Dr. Aman came up with this idea that we should use this time constructively to for academic enrichment and growth. And that is where we got together and we started working our heads off on what is the best way to use it. And over these series of six lectures that we've organized in the past 2 months, we have created a family of over 200 people, like-minded people like us. And you can see there are very varied topics that we have taken, right from scientific writing to ethics to forensic facial approximation. And also last time we conducted a skill development lecture in 2 parts, which was on educational video creation. And the participants were just so excited and enthusiastic, and we all created our podcast and screencasts and slidecast for the very first time. So we are also in the progress of learning by the means of these lectures. And this particular lecture, when it came up, systematic reviews and meta-analysis, we felt that this topic was so very important because healthcare interventions are a part of our everyday practice now. And evidence-based healthcare interventions are the need of the hour. And we are so fortunate that we got the best person for it, our course director, Dr. Pratap Tharyan, who would be introduced to you by our honorable chief guest, Professor O.P. Kharbanda. And it's a very tall task to even introduce Dr. O.P. Kharbanda for me. I'm his student. He's been my mentor for so long. And about him, he's currently holding position of Dr. C.G. Pandit, National Chair of Indian Council of Medical Research. And Dr. Kharbanda has been recently superannuated as Professor-in-Chief, Center for Dental Education and Research AIIMS. His interests in academics, his interest in research, his interest in technologies, it's worldwide. And it's not possible for me to kind of club up his achievements, his interests in one particular minute, which I have today. He's world known, and everybody knows him so well. And but personally, I have learned a lot from him, being his student, and also he's been my mentor. So I would request Dr. O.P. Kharbanda to please introduce our course director for the day, Dr. Pratap Tharyan. And before that, I would like to also wish everybody on International Yoga Day. And just a small saying, योग धर्म नहीं एक विज्ञान है, ये कल्याण का विज्ञान है. योग दिवस की हार्दिक शुभकामनाएं. And we are in the pursuit of technology, कल्याण. तो उसी के इवस में हम आगे बढ़ते हैं. I request Dr. O.P. Kharbanda to kindly introduce our course director.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka, and thank you, team. I'm really delighted to be with you. I will not taking much time because we are running behind schedule. So I only like to say that Professor Tharyan is well known in his area of evidence-based medicine. He retired as Professor of Psychiatry and Head of the Department at CN Civil Law, an institution which is highly respected for many reasons, including presence of Professor Tharyan there. The other thing which I just want to mention very briefly is that he is the founder of Cochrane Group in this particular region, and we have been immensely benefited by his work and his contribution as a Cochrane Collaborating Center on oral health which we created at CDR a few years ago. I will also like to add that the need today is to have evidence, what you have already said. And I think Dr. Tharyan will, through his 2 lectures, will take us through the journey. But I think it is a very, very vast subject. Maybe we will request him again to be with us after these 2 lectures. And I have been personally benefited by his contribution, because I have personally been to CMC Vellore to attend a course with him, which I don't know he remembers or not. It was many, many years ago. Yeah. And thank you, sir, for being with us. And about the course, I think I will not take much time. Will be as we go along, we will learn with you. And I'm going to attend. I'm also a participant, by the way, today. I requested Dr. Priyanka to be participant and then said, why don't you introduce Professor Tharyan? So that's how I am there in the picture. Thank you.
Thank you.
I request Dr. Kapoor to please switch off the screen sharing.
I've switched it off.
Okay, I'll shift the spotlight to.
Yeah.
Yeah, sir, you can share your.
Right. Okay. It's happy to be here, and I recognize you so much, Dr. Karbanda. And I'm really glad that I could attend this. I could be part of this session for you. Now, how do I share my video now? Right, here we go. So I've got this presentation that I shall take you through. Oh, it's planned to be, scheduled for about 45 minutes, but let's see how it goes. And this is basically meant as a basic introduction to the whole field of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Some of you who have attended the course will recognize some of these slides, but it's basically meant to be a revision for you. And next time I'll talk a little bit more in detail on meta-analysis. I hope that'll be okay with you. Now, what I will cover in this session are 5 main themes. One is the role of research synthesis in informing health decisions. The other is, what is a systematic review and how does it differ from a traditional review article? And I'll spend some time on the steps involved in doing a systematic review and meta-analysis of the effects of interventions. Then we look at what are the guidelines for reporting systematic reviews. And finally, we'll end up with what resources are available to actually help us in this process. So these are the main themes I'll go through. Now, you all heard of the term evidence-based medicine, which was coined by Gordon Guyatt, and together with Dave Sackett, they defined it as the integration of research, evidence, clinical expertise, and the values of patients. And it's clear that reliable evidence from research is a central component of evidence-based medicine. But unfortunately, many of us know that a lot of published research findings are clearly not believable. They're false. So the whole issue about trusting evidence has become a center point in today's conversations, because a lot of research is being done primarily for academic and industry-related purposes. So they're not necessarily designed in a way which can give us reliable results, which can help patients with their health conditions. And so many trials are designed in a way that deceives you into thinking that something works because that's what authors want, because of industry concerns and stuff. And there are many undisclosed conflicts of interest, so much so that many people really don't trust research. And if you look at this article, which was published in The Lancet some years ago, where Ian Chalmers, who was one of the founders of the Cochrane Collaboration, and their collaborators, they looked at trying to see how we can decide what evidence is good and what is not good. And they classified research according to whether it advances scientific knowledge or whether it's at least relevant to immediate application. And they had 4 quadrants. On the top left, you had research which is clearly advancing basic science. Then you also had some research which is clearly applicable to practical solutions for people. And then you had research which is a combination of the two. But 85% of the research they found in leading journals was largely waste. It did neither. Didn't help people, nor did it advance science. So what we need in order to ensure that our people have better health outcomes, we need reliable evidence that can inform decisions. And this evidence has to be relevant. And by relevant, it should be focused on a clinical problem, which needs answers. And we should be able to find studies which are designed and reported in a way that addresses this question and provides us reliable answers. And we also need to make sure that the body of evidence is complete. And it's not only looking at some studies, but all the studies, what do they all say? And those studies need to be evaluated to see whether they are done properly so that the biases don't affect the results. Because if a study is not done properly, you can't really trust the results. And we also need to make sure that we're looking at clinical importance, not just statistical significance from p-values. And finally, we need to make sure that this evidence is synthesized and is therefore, we want to know what the overall effects are and whether these effects are consistent and whether they've been contextualized for our use. Now, research synthesis is the method where you try and find and combine the results of multiple primary studies addressing a similar question. And it is aimed at generating new knowledge. So in a way, it is also research. But what it does is it compares and combines the results of multiple primary studies to either confirm what we know or to say what we know is wrong, or we were not sure about what we knew, and then to see how generalizable the results are. And systematic reviews and meta-analysis are the basic tools that we use in research synthesis. And you can synthesize the findings from research quantitatively or qualitatively, and very often we use both methods. And this presentation will focus on systematic reviews and meta-analysis of studies that are evaluating the effects of interventions, treatments used in healthcare, although the general approach can be used for prognosis, for prevalence, for incidence, for risk factors, for diagnostic accuracy. There are some deviations, but the general approach is virtually the same. Now, the first question is, can this whole approach actually help real life problems? Because if it cannot, you and I are wasting our time. And on a Sunday, just before lunch, it's not a good idea. So I'll give you an example which I've used very often of a clinical problem where there was a friend of mine I knew many years ago, this was in the 90s, who rang me up to tell me that she needed help because she's at risk of premature delivery, having already lost a child during childbirth because the child was born with respiratory distress and died. And her doctor said, because of your risk status, you should try a short course of corticosteroids, because he'd heard some good news about this. But my friend was a little concerned about whether steroids will actually help or harm, and wanted me to help her find the evidence. Now, having asked my professors at that time, they were not very sure about it because it was new stuff. I went and found on PubMed a study, which was a randomized controlled trial, where mothers due to deliver preterm were randomized either to get steroids or no steroids. And one of their main outcomes was neonatal death. And these are the findings, where they had 532 mothers randomized to get steroids, out of whom 36 neonates died, and 538 mothers not given steroids, 60 neonates died. So there seems to be a difference. Now the question is, how do you decide whether this difference is important? Now, traditionally, what we would do is we would do a chi-square test, because we're testing the null hypothesis, saying there really is no difference. And the chi-square test is a test for the difference in the proportions. And it looks to see whether this observed difference is greater than what you would get by chance. And the way you decide that is to look at the p-value. What is the probability of this difference being or not being due to chance? And traditionally, we take a p-value of 0.05 or less than that is considered statistically significant. And all statistical tests which are testing the null hypothesis use the same p-value. So it's very important for us to know what actually this p-value means. It basically tells you that if you get a p-value of 1, you're 100% sure this is due to chance. And if you get a p-value of 0, you're 100% sure this is not due to chance. So if you get a p-value of 0.5, it just basically means you don't know. It could be chance, it need not be chance. And when you get a p-value of 0.1, it basically means you're 90% sure this is not due to chance. And when you get a p-value of 0.05, it just means that you're 95% sure this is not a chance difference, this is a true difference. So when you say you get a p-value of less than 0.05, you're merely saying that you're more than 95% sure that the observed difference is not due to chance. Keep that in mind when you take a look at this. Now, I've got rows and columns. In the top 3 rows are the numbers and the response rate in the treatment arm. And in the next 3 rows, colored differently, this is the same in the control arm. And the columns give you sample sizes going from 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 to 100. Now, if you look at the response rate in those 2 arms, when you have 5 people in the treatment arm, 4 responded, it's 80% response, 4 by 5. And in the control arm, 2 out of 5 people responded, that's a 40% response rate. That's the actual response rate, and that doesn't change irrespective of your sample size. But when you look at p-value at the bottom, when you had 5 in each arm, your p-value was 0.29, which you would say is not statistically significant. Actually, what it means, you're about 71% sure this is not a chance difference. When you increase the sample size to 15 in each arm, your p-value is 0.03. Now you're 97% sure this difference is not due to chance. It's a true difference. But when you get 100 in each arm, your p-value is less than 0.0001, which basically means that there is a statistically significant difference, but what people report it as highly significant difference. And this highly significant conveys to many people the impression that this is a highly effective treatment. So a highly significant difference does not really tell us how effective the treatment is, because even with a p-value of 0.29, the treatment was much more effective than the control. You just could not show it, which is called your type 2 error. There is a difference, but your sample was too small to show it. So what we are interested in is clinically important differences. So look at this. It shows the percentage of patients who are in remission with drug A versus drug B at the end of 6 weeks. And if you look at the actual difference, it is 30% with drug A and 31.5% with drug B. 1% difference, but your p-value is less than 0.001. This will happen if you have got a very large sample size. So statistically significant, but clinically likely to be totally unimportant to patients. So what I'd like to stress here is when you're trying to look at evidence, we need to be aware that any observed difference between 2 groups may be very small, but it can be statistical significance by increasing your sample size. And p-values do not tell you how effective your intervention is and whether it's clinically important. So we want clinically important differences. And for that, we need to look at a different measure. So we have to look at estimating the effect rather than testing our hypothesis. So going back to our example, when 532 mothers were randomized and 36 neonates died, the risk of dying on steroids is the number of neonates who died in the mothers who got steroids. That's intuitive. And the risk of dying without steroids is the number of neonates who died when they didn't get steroids compared to the mothers who were randomized not to get steroids. These risks is called the risk ratio. And here it's 0.61. The relative risk or the risk ratio here means what is the risk on treatment? That's a proportion with the event. That is, here's death on treatment compared to the same proportion with the event on the control treatment. Now, how do you interpret this? First, you can see which intervention is better, because if your relative risk is 1, it means there's no difference. And if your outcome is phrased in a negative manner, like death, relapse, or not improved, anything less than 1, like 0.42, means that your, in this case, the steroid is better than no steroids. Experimental intervention is better. But if your relative risk was 1.42, it means that your control intervention is better or your experimental intervention is harmful, depending on what that outcome was. Now, if you change the way that you actually phrase the outcome and say alive or improved, then the interpretation is reversed. It's the opposite direction. Not only does it tell you which intervention is better, it tells you how much better. So if you get a relative risk of 0.42, it means the intervention reduces the risk of the negative outcome by 58%, 1 minus 0.42, or you can even say, if you want to express it as a percentage, 100 minus 42. That's 58. So there's a 58% reduction in the risk of dying with the experiment treatment compared to the other treatment. If it was 1.42, it means there's a 42% increase. How much more than 1? So this is the way you can interpret the relative risk. But And you can also look at not only the relative risk, but you can also look at the actual number of people, the risk reduction, which is one risk minus the other risk. And from that, you can get the number needed to treat to benefit, which is the inverse of the risk reduction. Okay, so these are the estimates that we can get from this study, but we also need to know, will the same estimates apply if you were to generalize this to other situations? So the confidence intervals tells you what are the range of risk ratios you can get as far as a best case or a worst case scenario. And it's a measure of uncertainty. It tells you that one trial is not purely representative of all the trials that can happen, and can also be a measure of precision. So when you have a very large sample size, your confidence intervals become, you've got more confidence in your estimates, right? And what we have to look at is, does the confidence interval include one? Is it less than, more than one? So if you've got a relative risk of 0.50, it tells you it's a 50% reduction. But 1.25 says it's a 25% increase. So this is an uncertain result and automatically statistically not significant. On the other hand, if your upper and lower limits of your confidence interval do not include one, then your result is automatically statistically significant and you are sure it either helps or harms. What's also important is if the lower limit of the confidence interval, here 0.73 or 0.99, if it's 0.73, it means that at the very least you expect a 27% reduction in the risk of that outcome, which is pretty good. A 27% reduction in death is fantastic. But on the other hand, if your lower limit is 0.99, it just means that you'll get a 1% reduction in that outcome. That's one possibility, which is not so good considering that your results come from a randomized controlled trial, which you have control over everything. In the real world, you don't get control over everything and your results are never going to be as good. So if you start off with a lower estimate of 1%, it's quite likely in the real world you will not get anything which is significant. So that's how you can use confidence intervals to tell you how sure are you of your effect estimate and how likely is it to be clinically significant in the real world. So you can actually go and download this free program called the CI calculator and bung in those numbers for the events and the total number in the control group and the experimental group and press 95% confidence interval and it'll give you all these things that you need to know with that. So it's a very useful program for you to calculate these results from papers which don't give you, they only give you a p-value, but you want to know, is it also clinically important? So what the evidence therefore now shows from this relative risk of 0.61, 0.41 to 0.90, it tells you that if you take steroids, as far as this study is concerned, the risk of premature death in neonates is reduced by 39%, 1 minus 0.61 or 100 minus 61, compared to not taking steroids. At the very least, you expect a 10% reduction, that is 100 minus 90. At the very best, you can even get a 59% reduction. So since both these extremes of the confidence interval don't include one, this is a statistically significant result. And if you consider at least a 10% reduction in death in prematurity as a good outcome, you'd be happy with this result. You can also look at it and say, what is the risk difference? If you treat with steroids compared to not treating with steroids, there'll be 4 less neonatal deaths per 100. So 0.044 divided by 100 is 4.4. Round it off, 4 less deaths per 100. And do the same for the confidence interval. It's between 1 to 8 less deaths. The other way of looking at it is the inverse of the risk difference, which is the number needed to treat to benefit. You need to treat 23 mothers with steroids to prevent 1 neonatal death due to prematurity. It could be as few as 12 or it could be as many as 104. So with this information, I can now attempt to answer my friend's question, whether she should take steroids. But what I need to, I've got this far. I know this result is statistically and clinically important, but my next question is, can I trust this evidence? That's what you call internal validity. Only then can I think about using the evidence, that is external validity, or should she use it? So I need to know, can I trust the results of this study? And for that, I need to be able to make sure there are no biases and it's not due to chance. Now, I already know it's not due to chance because I looked at the p-values in the confidence intervals, and it's not a chance difference. But I have to look and see what were the methods of the study to understand if there were biases. And when you're evaluating a randomized control trial to see whether there are any biases, you're interested in, was there selection bias, which means that were the people randomized to get the intervention or control very similar in terms of prognosis. That means any confounders were equally balanced in both arms, so that they are virtually the same as far as the prognosis is concerned at the start of the trial. And for that, you need to see how do they generate a random sequence that is unpredictable and which is also concealed from whoever is allotting people so that they can't fiddle the randomization sequence. So there are methods which people have to describe, which will give you confidence that they did this properly and prevented selection bias. Then I need to make sure that in order to make sure that everybody got the same treatment, nobody who was doing the experiment knew what treatment was being given, and the participants did not know whether they were getting the actual treatment or the control. I also need to know, of all the people who started the trial, did everybody end up being analyzed, or were there some people who dropped out? If they were dropped out were not available, was there a difference in the dropout rate between the treatment and the control arm? Because if there is a difference, which is quite large, it can affect your relative risk. So that's the other thing. Then when I'm looking at the outcome assessment, I need to make sure if the outcome is not something like death, which is a hard objective outcome, then if it's a subjective outcome, were the people assessing the outcome unaware of what treatments were being given? So this bit about blinding here, when you say double blind, actually you mean triple blind, because you want the participants not to know, the people giving the treatment not to know, and the outcome assessor not knowing. So you need to be described who was blind. And finally, we need to make sure that whatever they're reporting in their paper is actually what they did and not only statistically significant differences. So I had to go and look at that paper to see whether any of these biases there. And then I decided, no, this paper has reported it very well. Because if it is problems in these areas, I will not be able to trust the result. I just want to stress that concealing allocation is the way in which the randomization sequence is kept away from the person allotting treatment. Because if you don't conceal allocation, you cannot blind. And even if you cannot blind, like in surgical trials, you can conceal allocation by putting it, the randomization sequence is not known to the surgeon before he starts the treatment. We'll go into that later if you don't know what this means. So we're looking at selection and performance bias differentially. Now, when I actually got the results, I have to then decide, should I use it? Should I tell my friend to use the results? For that, I know that this is an important result. I know the outcomes are important. I know I can trust the results. But I also need to ask this question. This trial was done in Auckland. Is there any reason to believe that steroids won't work in India? So generalizing from some other study, I don't think that steroids will work differently in India, but I also have to worry about safety. While the paper did not report any harms, steroids can cause some infections. And so if you deliver in an unsafe environment, you could perhaps increase neonatal sepsis. This study was done in a high-income country. So if I want to use this for my friend, I'll have to advise her to ensure that there is there is cleanliness in the birth and the afterbirth. It's affordable. The treatment is easily available. It's very practical to take. It's just a tablet. And I couldn't think of any other alternatives there. So I could then ask my friend, what would you like? Given all these situations, would you like to take steroids? But before I do that, I have to make sure that I have all the evidence, which means that I got to look for other RCTs, and I found one. Now I'm showing the results of my trial here in a graphical form, where that vertical line is a line of no difference. Anything to the left of the line is less than 1, and to the right of the line is more than 1. And that blob in the center is the effect estimate from the trial we looked at, 0.61. And the horizontal line is the width of the confidence interval. So the width, the part of it, the line closest to the vertical line is 0.90, and that's 0.61. So one look at it and I know this treatment is better than control, and by how much. Unfortunately, I found another trial, the same kind of question being asked, but it had a smaller sample size, a wider confidence intervals, which didn't necessarily give me the answer I wanted. So this is around the time that I came across the a systematic review done by the Cochrane collaboration, which is captured in its logo. At that time, this had only 7 trials of steroids versus no steroids to prevent death due to preterm births, and 2 of the trials favored steroids. One of them was the one we had looked at. They found another one. Because they were very systematic in their search, they found totally 7 trials, but 5 of them either showed no difference or could even cause harm. Now, typically, when you're doing a review article, you would say there were 2 trials, 4 and 5 against or not so sure. So you'll be doing what is called vote counting. The problem with vote counting is that the large studies like 1,000 patients in ligands and a small study with a very wide confidence interval will cancel each other out if you were counting votes, 1 for, 1 against. So what the collaboration did was they pooled the results in a meta-analysis, which gave more weight to the studies which had larger sample sizes and more narrow confidence intervals because they had more events. And that gives you a proportionate pooled estimate of whether steroids help or harm. And from that, I could actually tell my friend to use steroids. Many years later, I went and looked at an update. There's an update even after this, by which time they had found 21 studies, and they found that many more outcomes are not even contemplated. They said steroids are safe even there. And it confirmed that neonatal death is prevented. This time, the confidence intervals were now 0.58 to 0.81, not 0.91, like ligands had shown. So they were more confident because they had more studies, narrower confidence intervals, saying steroids work. They also gave me so many other outcomes that I had not even thought of, but this whole body of evidence is important for us to know whether or not steroids are helpful. Now, what we need to do when we read stuff like this, very rapidly say, are all these outcomes statistically significant as well as clinically important? And what you need to do that is look at the lower limit of the confidence interval. The least estimate is a 27% reduction in the risk of RDS. That's good. I'm happy with a 27% reduction. If I look at cerebroventricular hemorrhage, it's 0.69. That's almost a 31% reduction. That's good. Necrotizing enterocolitis, lower limit is 7.74. It's a 26% reduction. But here is where I have a problem. Respiratory support intensive care admissions, relative risk shows a 20% reduction, but the least estimate is only 1%. This is statistically significant because it doesn't cross 1, but may not be clinically important because it comes from very 2 small studies. So I'm unsure about the clinical significance of this result. Systemic infections, 15% reduction. If you think 15% is good enough, there you go. So that's how I was able to use a systematic review or research synthesis to answer a clinical question. The systematic reviews provide answers that individual trials cannot. So let's just look at what exactly is systematic review and a meta-analysis. The first thing to stress is a systematic review is not the same as a meta-analysis. A systematic review is a way in which you apply scientific strategies that limit bias in the way you look for the evidence, you collect your data and synthesize it so that you can get a bias-free, reliable answer to a specific clinical question. You can use quantitative methods if you have data that can be combined. This quantitative combining is called meta-analysis. But there are many systematic reviews who don't have a meta-analysis. Systematic review is a larger thing than a meta-analysis. The meta-analysis only refers to the statistical method that combines the results of several studies. And what you're trying to do is to try and see on average, how does drug A compare to drug B? And therefore you take all the studies which give you that outcome from drug A or drug B, and before you pool the results together, some studies are given more weight than the others. And I'll tell you how they do that. The main advantage is you get more power and therefore more precision because your sample size now is a combined sample size compared to the individual studies. We may have small sample sizes. But if you just do a meta-analysis without thinking of all the things that a systematic review needs to consider, you may end up with only a biased subset of published trials called publication bias, or you may not really pay attention to seeing how much bias there are in the individual studies, in which case then your pooled result is misleading. Or if you get a pooled result which says the treatment works or doesn't work, but the individual studies differ widely among themselves, then that pooled average cannot be trusted. And finally, just because the pooled result says it works, doesn't mean you have to use it. You have to contextualize it for your needs. So that's how a systematic review is built, to give you all these things from a meta-analysis. So the major differences between systematic reviews and meta-analysis are, one, that we are addressing a focused clinical question, asking, in this population, does this intervention compared to another intervention, how does it work for very specific outcomes measured at certain time points? And the major difference is that a systematic review has a method section, which is often peer-reviewed or at least registered online in a database called Prospero, which is a prospective registration site for systematic reviews. The search is not limited to just one database, but multiple databases, so that we get the whole body of evidence. And then every systematic review has got a clear description of what we're going to search for, what search terms we're going to use, where all are we going to search, and when we exclude studies, why did we exclude them? We generally, in a systematic review, try and look at the best study designed to answer that question. If we mix study designs, they are analyzed separately. And for each of the studies, we assess the risk of the bias in that study and how is it likely to affect the outcome of that study. And also, when we pool the results, how is the pooled result affected by some studies that maybe had at risk of bias? And we don't look at things like p-values at all. We look at the effect estimates and their confidence intervals as we looked at it. And we give more weight to some studies than to others. So there are lots of other differences that help systematic reviews become quite objective in the way that we are trying to get this done. And at the end, we look at the numerical results and the confidence intervals for each outcome, and then do a process called grade, which we will cover next time, which tells you how certain am I that we will get the same result as this review suggests that we would get. Good systematic reviews are frequently updated, so they become like living evidence, and they adhere to international standards of conduct. And the support, if you do a Cochrane review, is quite a lot, because there are very strong editorial teams which help you with the rule. So review articles can be very influential, but that often depends on who does it. Whereas Cochrane reviews are considered good quality because of the methods that are used. Now, the other major importance is if you don't combine and don't do a cumulative search of evidence, you'll end up with this. This looks very formidable, but basically, if you look at the left of the line, you see a vertical line, which is the line of no difference, and many, many horizontal lines with blobs on them. They are the effect estimates, in this case, odds ratios and confidence intervals for 33 trials done over 3 decades, randomizing more than 36,000 patients to either get streptokinase or not get streptokinase after an acute myocardial infarction to prevent death. If you look at the individual trials, they're all over the place. But the pooled effect estimate clearly shows that the treatment is better. That is, streptokinase saves lives. Now the authors looked at this and said, did we need 33 years, 33 trials, and 36,000 patients to answer this question? Could we have not known this earlier? So on the right, what they did is a cumulative meta-analysis where they pooled the first study with the second study, then the second and the third study with the second and first and second. And they were able to see that by 1973 or so, after having randomized only 2,432 patients, you already knew that streptokinase saves lives. But the world kept randomizing people to get more and more trials. GISI, 11,000 patients, ISIS, 17,000 patients. All it did was give you narrow confidence intervals. Now, if you had known, if you were part of an ethics committee in 73 and GISI and ISIS were being, permission was being asked and you had pooled the results, it's highly unlikely you'd have given them permission because it is, unethical to do that. So while in the real world, in the research world, we were killing patients by doing unnecessary trials, in the real world, we were killing patients because we were not recommending the appropriate treatments. In fact, it was only as late as 1985 that the textbook started recommending thrombolysis as specific treatment for acute MI. And all the while, what were they recommending? Things that were showing increasing evidence that it can cause harm, prophylactic lidocaine. So this was the editorial in JAMA talking about this, saying that life-saving treatments were delayed by more than a decade, while other treatments were recommended long after controlled research had shown them to be harmful. So that's why we need to be able to synthesize evidence, and we'll talk a little bit about how do you do a systematic review? And I'm using Cochrane as an example because they're the ones who do the best reviews. So the first is to formulate your research question: patient, intervention, comparisons, outcomes, time points, and what kind of study you want to look at. Then you put together a team and you register a title with the Cochrane collaboration. If you go to their website, I'll show you the website, there are various review groups. You have to write to them saying, this is what we would like to do. They'll ask you to fill in a form and register the title. And if they accept it, you write a protocol which is peer reviewed and then published. If you're doing a non-Cochrane review, at this stage, you register this protocol in Prospero. And then you proceed with the job of locating and selecting the studies, assessing the studies for risk of bias. Then you extract the data and put it into a software which will analyze and present your results. And then you summarize the results, and then you summarize it and conclude about how certain you are about the results. And then you write up the implication for practice. Now, the protocol includes everything that is marked with an asterisk, right up to step number 10, because all of these things need to be mentioned in your protocol. This is how we're going to do it. And once the review is published, in a 2 years' time, Cochrane expects you to update and improve the review. So this is the basic steps of doing a good quality review. So let me give you an example of a lady who was in Sri Lanka working with the anti-malaria campaign, who wanted to know in 2002, why is it that India, Sri Lanka, and some other countries in the region give 5 days of primaquine to kill the liver forms of Vivax parasite after giving chloroquine to kill the blood forms, when WHO says you should use 14 days of primaquine after giving chloroquine? Why do we give only 5 days? So what she did was work with the Cochrane Infectious Diseases group, and we got involved to help her. And the questions she asked was the role of primaquine in preventing relapse in people with Plasmodium vivax. So we have to first define the question, which is a 4-part PICO statement, and the study design. So the review said, we want to compare alternative primaquine regimens to the recommended 14-day regimen for preventing relapse in P. vivax malaria treated with chloroquine. We also want to see why some people say you don't even need to use primaquine because primaquine can cause hydrolysis and things of that sort. So what happens if you don't give primaquine? And you compare just chloroquine versus nothing and primaquine versus chloroquine. So then you have to write the methods up. So what kind of studies? We're looking at randomized trials. We're looking at participants, clearly defining what the participants were and excluding mixed infections. What kind of interventions we want to look at? The primaquine compared to chloroquine, or primaquine compared to nothing, like placebo after primaquine, different doses, or compared to chloroquine. Then what are our primary outcome measures and what are our secondary outcome measures? This is something that we need to have some content knowledge about why you're choosing these measures, which are clinically important. And once you got that PICO, you can then design your search strategy, because you look at patients, a problem, you have to look at primaquine, the malaria, Vivax malaria, and look at different words for Vivax malaria and combine them. And then look at what is your intervention, which is primaquine. So we need to be able to look for malaria words plus primaquine words to design our search. So the search is quite extensive. We search multiple databases to actually make sure that we get all these trials, including conference proceedings, writing to authors. And we also look for ongoing trials. And we have to describe this in the protocol in the future tense. We will do. So the databases that were searched and the dates of the search are given there, and the conference proceedings are given in the review. And then the search strategy. So for example, if you look at the second one, Sentinel, it says one term primaquine or capital primaquine, 1 or 2. Either of this, then Vivax, Plasmodium vivax or Vivax malaria, combined together is 4 or 5. So we want to look at 3, which is 1 or 2, and 7. So whatever we are searching for should have the word primaquine as well as Vivax malaria. So some searches are simple, some get more complicated. Then this is the list of all the conference proceedings that we do. So you can see there's a lot of detail given in the review, the search, the other search. And then when you finally do the review, we will actually provide a PRISMA flow diagram, which tells us what number of studies we reviewed and how many we excluded, what were the reasons, So a very detailed assessment of the quality of our search. We'll also describe a qualitative description of the studies, where they came from, who were randomized, were they children, adults, so that people have a qualitative synthesis of all the studies that we retrieved. And then we also described in the protocol, how are we going to assess, select the studies, and what will we do with studies that were excluded. So we have to describe, why did they exclude a study? If it was a randomized trial, it could have been that they didn't use the correct comparisons, or it may not have been a randomized trial. So the reasons for exclusion and the references are given. Then we have to write a section on how are we planning to extract the data, and what kind of outcome measures are we going to use? Are we going to use relative risks, things of that sort? And how are we going to assess risk of bias in each of these studies? So Cochrane has a lot of software to help us assess the risk of bias, which is looking at basically whether there's selection, performance, detection, and reporting biases. And after we extract the data from each study, where we talk about the methods, participants, interventions, and outcomes, we enter all this data from the studies, included studies, and whatever notes we want to look at from each study. We will also try and assess risk of bias. So we'll take each of these domains, and we will make a decision on whether it is low risk, and we will provide a support from the paper to say, why are we saying it's low risk? Here it's because they use a computer generated randomization schedule, which is a good way of randomizing. Then we go on to allocation concealment for selection bias. But here our answer is high risk. And that's because this particular paper said that they did allocation concealment, but when you look at the results, we found that they should have had 150 participants randomized 1:1:1. If they did that, you'd expect 50, 50, 50 in each arm, but here we're getting 50, 59, and 42. That cannot happen if they had concealed allocation. So we came to our conclusion something went wrong in the way they concealed allocation. So our judgment is high risk. Like that, we go through each of those and make a judgment about risk, which means that you need to know what are the elements of risk of bias in each of the studies. The program then allows you to come up with these graphs and figures. Overall, what is the risk of bias across the studies? And for each individual study, what is the risk? If you're doing non-randomized studies, there are other tools, which I'll share this presentation. You can look at that, which tells you how to assess risk of bias in non-randomized studies like case control or cohort studies, etc. Now we come to the final part. How do we meta-analyze or data synthesis? So the principles are, we're trying to provide a weighted average of the effects of one intervention compared to the other. So basically you need at least 2 studies which give you data for that particular outcome, and they should come from comparable populations, interventions, and comparisons. Because if they are similar, then when you combine those outcomes, you can say this is the average outcome because everything is more or less the same. We are not comparing patients from one trial with patients in another trial or control group in another trial. That way you break the power of randomization. Each trial is analyzed separately. We look at their relative risks, and then we pool the relative risks. So we look at each outcome from each study which provides that outcome, and then take all the data per outcome, right? And you may find a trial which provides data only for one outcome. Some trials may provide data for all the outcomes. So depending on what data each trial which satisfies your inclusion criteria gives you, you would take the data relevant for your outcome. So when we talk about summary statistics, you're talking about risk ratios, odds ratios, whatever it is that you choose. Then before the pooling is done, there is a way in which the program gives more weight to some studies and less weight to the other studies. And we'll discuss how that is done. So if you've got dichotomous data like dead or alive, you can look at a risk ratio, you can look at a risk difference, or you can look at odds ratios. I'll discuss that next time. If you've got continuous data like means, they look at mean and standard deviation. They look at the difference in the mean and standard deviation with their confidence intervals. Or you can also use time to event data like hazard ratios. Now, let's talk about how do you weight studies when you're doing a meta-analysis. So this is a general rule. If you got a study which has got more participants and they've had more events, more deaths, particularly in the control group. So what I'm talking about in the control group means what is a baseline risk? Without the treatment, how many people will die? That is the risk in that population. If that risk is low, then you're uncertain of your result. And what will end up is you will end up with a low variance. high variance. Variance means the spread of your distribution is quite wide. So variance is a difficult term for some people to understand. So the way I'd like you to understand it is, the variance is used to calculate your confidence interval, the standard error, right? So if you want low variance, think of narrow confidence interval. If there is wide variance, think of a wide confidence interval. So net effect is, studies which have got a narrow confidence interval generally will have more participants, they'll have more events, and it'll automatically have a lower variance. You give them more weight, because weight is proportional to inverse variance. High variance, low weight. Low variance, high weight. Wide confidence intervals, low weight. Narrow confidence intervals, more weight. So I'm giving you an example. 6 studies where people who had head injury were given controlled hypothermia to assess whether it can reduce deaths. If you look at these 6 studies, the relative risk and the confidence intervals, you will see that this 4th study is the one which has got the narrowest confidence interval. This doesn't include 1, everything else includes 1. So you would say, okay, that study, according to my advice, should get more weight. Now let's look at the actual numbers. When you look at the actual numbers, people start getting confused, because they say the 4th study has only got 24 and 23, but this 5th study, Marion, has got 42 and 39. Shouldn't that get more weight? Right? Because of the larger sample size. But as I say, it's a combination of sample size, number of events, particularly in the control group. Look at the risk in the control group. Baseline is 14 out of 24 compared to 10 out of 42 in the 5th study. So because of all these variables together, it's the 4th study that gets the weight. So the point I'm trying to make is, you don't have to do anything. The program does it for you. You need to understand, when you have narrow confidence intervals, that study has got more weight in the meta-analysis. So I'll discuss how you calculate weights in more detail next time. But let's just go on to the last few slides, steps on doing a meta-analysis. So in our review, we were looking at not drug A versus drug B, but we were looking at 5 days versus 14 days, right? But then we also found comparisons where there were, we were looking at no primaquine. So there was 5 days of primaquine versus no primaquine. Then there were also studies looking at 14 days of primaquine versus no primaquine after chloroquine. So these are all separate comparisons. So they will be separately analyzed. 5 versus 14, 5 versus nothing, 14 versus nothing. That's the first thing you do, set up the comparisons. Then you look for each comparison, what are your outcomes? Death, relapse, whatever it is. Then for each outcome, you look for studies which reported on that comparison, what is the outcome of death? Then you extract the figures and you say, okay, I want to use relative risk. Then the meta-analysis is done and you get a pool result. And then you've got to do things like, are the results consistent? All of this we'll discuss next week. But these are the steps in doing a meta-analysis. So I want to just basically stop on this point of saying, this is a basic forest plot from a meta-analysis, which you need to understand. So this is created using the program Cochrane provides called RevMan. So that's why it looks exactly like this. But here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 studies identified by the surname of the first author and the year of publication. And the outcome is death. So with drug A, the first study says 2 people died out of 25, and with drug B, 6 out of 23 died. So this is the data we extract from the paper, all the papers, and we enter that. And that's about all you do when you're using this program, because the program does everything else. What it then does is, for each study, it calculates a relative risk and confidence interval. This is not weighted. So if you calculate it using the confidence interval calculator, you'll get the same result, 0.31, 0.07 to 0.17. Then the program gives you a graphical description of the results along where it stands according to the line of no effect. So this one crosses the line, this one crosses, this one goes on the other side, this one is on this side, and this one is entirely on this side. And this is also a study which has got a very big blob in the center. Now that big blob corresponds to the weight given to that study. So pi gets 60% of the weight in the overall meta-analysis, which means its result is giving most thing to the result, right? And if you want to look and say, okay, study sample size, the reason why it got is because a very large sample size, I will say, no, look again. The reason why it got such a large thing is the confidence interval. It's a study with the narrowest confidence interval. I'll stress this point, which is a study which has the next largest sample size. If you look, it's Jesani, the third study, 85 and 85 in each arm, but it got the least weight. Why? Because it's got the widest confidence interval. And why did that happen? Because if you look at the risk of death in the control group, 5 out of 85, it's very low. And you find that it's got a very wide confidence interval, so that got the least weight. That is the pooled effect estimate. So this diamond, if it touches 1, automatically you'll get the lower limit will be 0, it will be 1. Right here, it says there's potentially a 30% reduction in the risk of death with drug A compared to B. It could be as good as a 50% reduction, but at the very least, we expect at least a 1% reduction. Now, because it doesn't include 1, it is statistically significant. This last line is the test for statistical significance. It says P is 0.04. If that lower limit touches 1, that will become P equals 0.05, right? So it's statistically significant, but as I said before, we can't be very sure it's going to be clinically important with the lower limit of 0.99. So this is the basic forest plot. Next time, I'll take it in more detail and tell you what we need to do after this to be sure that this is the actual result, and then create summary of findings tables. And we also look at different kinds of data, like things like means and standard deviation. How do we use those? Standard difference. We look at heterogeneity. Everything you may want to know, please send your requests for what you want to know. Now, this is a very good resource. At the moment, it is still free. Please go to this website, download this software. Very soon, it'll become an online resource, which you will not be able to access free unless you're doing a Cochrane review. Very versatile software. And from that software, you can also access through the help file, the handbook, which is constantly updated, which tells you everything you want to know about doing a systematic review. There are various pointers. And if you look at the setup, which I just highlighted, gives you everything that anybody would want to know about doing a good systematic review if you read it. And particularly on meta-analysis, it's got chapters on how do you do various things that we talked about now. And then it looks at special topics like what do you do when you've got different kinds of trials, how do you do multiple treatment meta-analysis, everything that you want to know about that. And if you're using non-randomized studies, how do you go about combining the results of non-randomized studies? So these are very useful pointers for you to learn. The other thing to keep in mind is that you can do systematic reviews. We are talking about interventions, but you can use it for anything. But depending on the biases, some people are very tempted to combine anything that's available. But if you really want results that are trustworthy, you should do systematic reviews for the best study that can give you the best answer, depending on your question. So you need to learn a little bit more about all these study designs and stuff. And for that, I think the best resource you can use is the Equator Network. It's a very lovely website for doing any kind of research, because young researchers will find this very useful. And you can look at all the reporting guidelines for the various kinds of studies and their extensions, especially if you're interested in doing reviews of cohort studies and case control studies. You need to know what the reporting guidelines are for those. And then you can also access the PRISMA statement, which is the reporting guideline for doing systematic reviews. And all of these are freely downloadable. If you want to assess how good a systematic review is, there is an instrument called AmStar. Now, there's another version of AmStar. Just type AmStar online and you'll get it. It tells you how you can evaluate a systematic review to see how good it is and how well it is done, and whether you can trust it. So these are all things that you can all practice on existing systematic reviews. This is a website of the Cochrane collaboration. Just write cochrane.org. And from this, you get a lot of resources. It gives you abstracts of Cochrane evidence, but also here, it tells you how you can join Cochrane and become a Cochrane contributor. Cochrane is now opening up the whole scope. So you don't have to do a systematic review to be a contributor. You can do many other things. They have crowdsourcing of various. So you learn a lot that way if you get involved in this. And this is the actual Cochrane library website. Cochrane had given this as a free resource during the pandemic. We used to have a national license many years earlier, as long as I was in charge of the Cochrane South Asia. I'm no longer in charge. So all of you need to start lobbying to get free access to the Cochrane Library should the access come. And this is the link to our website, the V.V. Moses Center. If you click on it, you'll find there is a training panel which gives you details of all the online training that we do in the future. And we're very, very happy to have you join our online modules, which will be increasing in the future. And I want to thank you and say this is not the big end of this module.